We want to design motion that feels natural and familiar. And while using the right type of easing already helps, these easings are made based on a curve and a duration. That means that we can't create perfectly natural motion because the movement in the world around us doesn't have a fixed duration. Notice how with CSS animations and transitions, we always have to provide a duration. Spring animations can help here as they are based on the behavior of an object attached to a spring in a physical world, so it feels more natural by definition. They are also not parameterized by duration, making them continuous and fluid. The example below, that I by the way borrowed from Josh Comio because it's amazing, shows the difference between a spring and an ease animation. Notice how the bottom ball slows down more naturally. That's the effect that a spring animation can give us. Spring animations are heavily used in iOS. It's also the default animation in SwiftUI. When I tried recreating the dynamic island for the web, I said that it feels like a living organism. I believe it's mainly because of the spring animation being applied there. Like we said before, a spring animation can be created by describing the behavior of an object attached to a spring. This is done by providing values for mass, tension, and velocity. These properties can be quite unintuitive as there is no real object with a mass or a spring with stiffness here, so I created a visualizer to help you understand how each value influences the animation. This visualizer is heavily inspired by Morse's work. Apple has come up with an alternative method for configuring springs based solely on duration and bounce. Frame motion allows you to define a spring animation with the same approach. This means that we start using the duration parameter again, but here it refers to the perceptual duration, which is the time it takes for an animation to feel like it's finished, even though there is still some very subtle movement involved. This allows us to create more natural movement without sacrificing the duration parameter. It's also easier to understand and use, as we don't have to think about mass, tension, and velocity. Spring animations are also interruptible. Sometimes when an animation hasn't yet finished, we need to start a new one. When that happens, a spring animation uses the velocity it had when it was retargeted, making the movement feel smooth and natural. You can see it in action in this demo where I click around to change the end position while the animation is still ongoing. Notice how the ball changes its movement very smoothly. When I was making Sonar, I made the mistake of trying to use a CSS animation for the enter transition. What then happened is, if I quickly added 2 toasts, the first toast would jump into its new position because CSS animations are not interruptible. While spring animations can have a bouncy effect, there are only a few instances in Product UI where a bounce is appropriate in my opinion. For a more physical feel, a slight bounce at the end of a drag gesture, for example, might make sense. Notice how in this demo, when I drag it to dismiss, we have a slight bounce at the end. If I close it by just pressing, however, there is no bounce at all. I tend to avoid bounce in most cases, and if I do decide to use it, it's a very small value. No bounce at all should generally be your default to ensure a natural transition that feels elegant. Unless you're going for a different vibe, of course. You might be thinking, why use easing if spring animations are more natural, interruptible, and so on? Unfortunately, it's currently impossible to create spring animations in CSS. You can only create spring-like animations with the linear function, but it's still just an approximation. Libraries such as FrameMotion or React Spring can help, though their size is quite large. You don't necessarily need spring animations for simple transitions like color or opacity changes. However, they can change animations that involve motion, even a simple toggle. It's a trade-off that requires consideration. The difference in this toggle example is obviously very subtle, and you might not even be able to guess which one is using spring animations, it's the one on the right, but I strongly believe that this doesn't go unnoticed, even if it's subconscious. It adds up to the overall feeling of the product in the end. I will give you an example of how I considered adding spring animations to Vol. I wanted it to feel like the iOS sheet component, which utilizes spring animations. This would mean that I would need to use a library like FrameMotion. However, I wanted to keep Vol's package size small, so using a large library wasn't really an option. I decided to prioritize a smaller package size over a more native feel in this case. Can you notice the small bounce that gets applied on iOS when you interact with snap points? That's not really possible with Vol, because we don't use spring animations, though that's a good trade-off to make in my opinion. Now, we have covered the theory of spring animations, and even though we have also seen some examples, you might still have some questions. That's why we will build two components that rely heavily on spring animations very soon. The App Store-like cards and the dynamic island. For now, I highly recommend visiting the links in the resources section, as they contain a lot of valuable information about spring animations.